Chapter 36 of the Adventures of Ferdinand Count Fathom by Tobias Smollett. Recording is in the public domain. Among those who were distinguished by his gallantry was the young wife of an old citizen of London, who had granted her permission to reside at the hot well for the benefit of her health, under the eye and inspection of his own sister, who was a maiden of 50 years. The pupil, whose name was Mrs. Trapwell, though low in stature, was finely shaped, her countenance engaging, though her complexion was brown, her hair and colour rivalled the raven's back, and her eyes emulated the lustre of the diamond. Fathom had been struck with her first appearance, but found it impracticable to elude the vigilance of her duenna, so as to make a declaration of his flame, until she herself, guessing the situation of his thoughts, and not displeased with the discovery, thought proper to furnish him with the opportunity he wanted, by counterfeiting an indisposition, for the cure of which she knew his advice would be implored. This was the beginning of an acquaintance, which was soon improved to his wish; and so well did she manage her attractions, as in some measure to fix the inconstancy of his disposition; for, at the end of the season, his passion was not sated, and they concerted the means of continuing their commerce even after their return to London. This intercourse effectually answered the purpose of the husband, who had been decoyed into matrimony by the cunning of his spouse, whom he had privately kept as a concubine before marriage. Conscious of her own precarious situation, she had resolved to impose upon the infirmities of Trapwell, and, feigning herself pregnant, gave him to understand she could no longer conceal her condition from the knowledge of her brother, who was an officer in the army, and of such violent passions, that, should he once discover her backsliding, he would undoubtedly wipe away the stains of his family dishonour with her own blood, as well as that of her keeper. The citizen, to prevent such a catastrophe, took her to wife, but soon after perceiving the trick which had been played upon him, set his invention at work, and at length contrived a scheme which he thought would enable him not only to retrieve his liberty, but also indemnify himself for the mortification he had undergone. Far from creating any domestic disturbance, by upbraiding her with her finesse, he seemed perfectly well pleased with his acquisition; and, as he knew her void of any principle, and extremely addicted to pleasure, he chose proper occasions to insinuate that she might gratify her own inclination, and at the same time turn her beauty to good account. She joyfully listened to these remonstrances, and, in consequence of their mutual agreement, she repaired to Bristol Spring, on pretence of an ill state of health, accompanied by her sister-in-law, whom they did not think proper to entrust with the real motive of her journey. Fathom's person was agreeable, and his finances supposed to be in flourishing order. Therefore she selected him from the herd of gallants, as a proper sacrifice to the powers which she adored, and on her arrival in London made her husband acquainted with the importance of her conquest. Trapwell overwhelmed her with caresses and praise for her discreet and dutiful conduct, and faithfully promised that she should pocket in her own privy purse 1/2 of the spoils that should be gathered from her gallant, whom she therefore undertook to betray, after he had swore, in the most solemn manner, that his intention was not to bring the affair to a public trial, which would redound to his own disgrace, but to extort a round sum of money from the Count, by way of composition. Confiding in this protestation, she in a few days gave him intelligence of an assignation she had made with our adventurer, at a certain Benigno near Covent Garden, upon which he secured the assistance of a particular friend, and his own journeyman, with whom and a constable he repaired to the place of rendezvous, where he waited in an adjoining room, according to the directions of his virtuous spouse, until she made the preconcerted signal of hemming 3 times aloud, when he and his associates rushed into the chamber, and surprised our hero in bed with his inamorata. The lady on this occasion acted her part to a miracle. She screamed at their approach, and, after an exclamation of "ruined and undone," fainted away in the arms of her spouse, who had by this time seized her by the shoulders, and began to upbraid her with her infidelity and guilt. As for Fathom, his affliction was unutterable, when he found himself discovered in that situation, and made prisoner by the 2 assistants, who had pinioned him in such a manner that he could not stir, much less accomplish an escape. All his ingenuity and presence of mind seemed to forsake him in this emergency. The horrors of an English jury overspread his imagination, for he at once perceived that the toil into which he had fallen was laid for the purpose. Consequently, he took it for granted that there would be no deficiency in point of evidence. Soon as he recollected himself, he begged that no violence might be offered to his person, and entreated the husband to favour him with a conference, in which the affair might be compromised, without prejudice to the reputation of either. At first Trapwell breathed nothing but implacable revenge, but, by the persuasion of his friends, after he had sent home his wife in a chair, he was prevailed upon to hear the proposals of the delinquent, who, having assured him, by way of apology, that he had always believed the lady was a widow, made him an offer of £500 as an atonement for the injury he had sustained; this being a sum no ways adequate to the expectation of the citizen, who looked upon the Count as a possessor of an immense estate. He rejected the terms with disdain, and made instant application to a judge, from whom he obtained a warrant for securing his person till the day of trial. Indeed, in this case, money was but a secondary consideration with Trapwell, whose chief aim was to be legally divorced from a woman he detested. Therefore, there was no remedy for the unhappy Count, who in vain offered to double the sum. He found himself reduced to the bitter alternative of procuring immediate bail, or going directly to Newgate. In this dilemma, he sent a messenger to his friend Ratchcali, whose countenance fell when he understood the Count's condition; nor would he open his mouth in the style of consolation, until he had consulted a certain solicitor of his acquaintance, who assured him the law abounded with such resources as would infallibly screen the defendant, had the fact been still more palpable than it was. He said there was a great presumption to believe the Count had fallen a sacrifice to a conspiracy, which by some means or other would be detected, and in that case the plaintiff might obtain 1 shilling in lieu of damages. If that dependence should fail, he hinted that, in all probability, the witnesses were not incorruptible, or, should they prove to be so, one man's oath was as good as another's, and, thank Heaven, there was no dearth of evidence provided money could be found to answer the necessary occasions. Ratchcali, comforted by these insinuations, and dreading the resentment of our adventurer, who, in his despair, might punish him severely for his want of friendship, by some precipitate explanation of the commerce they had carried on, moved, I say, by these considerations, and moreover tempted with the prospect of continuing to reap the advantages resulting from their conjunction, he and another person of credit with whom he largely dealt in jewels, condescended to become sureties for the appearance of Fathom, who was accordingly admitted to bail. Not but that the Tyrolese knew Ferdinand too well to confide in his parole. He depended chiefly upon his ideas of self-interest, which he thought would persuade him to risk the uncertain issue of a trial rather than quit the field before the harvest was half over; and he was resolved to make his own retreat without ceremony, should our hero be unwise enough to abandon his bail. Such an adventure could not long lie concealed from the notice of the public, even if both parties had been at pains to suppress the circumstances; but the plaintiff, far from seeking to cover, affected to complain loudly of his misfortune, that he might interest his neighbours in his behalf, and raise a spirit of rancour and animosity, to influence the jury against this insolent foreigner, who had come over into England to debauch our wives and deflower our daughters; while he employed a formidable band of lawyers to support the indictment, which he laid at £10,000 damages. Meanwhile, Fathom and his associate did not fail to take all proper measures for his defence. They retained a powerful bar of counsel, and the solicitor was supplied with £100 after another, to answer the expense of secret service, still assuring his clients that everything was in excellent train, and that his adversary would gain nothing but shame and confusion of face. Nevertheless, there was a necessity for postponing the trial, on account of a material evidence, who, though he wavered, was not yet quite brought over; and the attorney found means to put off the decision from term to term, until there was no quibble left for further delay. While this suit was depending, our hero continued to move in his usual sphere, nor did the report of his situation at all operate to his disadvantage in the polite world. On the contrary, it added a fresh plume to his character in the eyes of all those who were not before acquainted with the triumphs of his gallantry. Notwithstanding this countenance of his friends, he himself considered the affair in a very serious light; and perceiving that, at any rate, he must be a considerable loser, he resolved to double his assiduity in trade, that he might be the more able to afford the extraordinary expense to which he was subjected. Chapter 36.